and I will be supporting it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Larson. Go ahead, Councillor Boyle, then Stauber, then Gardner.
Thank you, President Hartman. Again, I just want to say, and I know other councilors have said the same thing, whereas on a local level, the 148th Fighter Wing is an example of a military unit doing more with less and serves as a model of prudent military spending. And, you know, mark my words and mark everybody else on this council, we're in for full support of our 148th, especially on the national defense. We need that. Every country needs that. Even Switzerland has that. The point where it becomes an issue is where we're spending 59 cents of every dollar of federal discrepancy spending and funding military purposes is where I have a real hard issue with this as a local representative. This basically means that we're ignoring our national issues. And coming from real experience that's on the Public Utilities Commission, where I've had been fortunate to serve for the last 2 years, and just agonize of the nickel and diming that we have to do to our constituents to pay for essential city services, meaning our streets, our sewers, our water. And this is not only in Duluth, this is across the nation, where our infrastructure is crumbling. And, you know, to make it short, you know, I agree with Councilor Kraus that military does in our area support a lot of local jobs, as it does across the U.S. But I bring up the counter argument, and I look deep into that, is, you know, my grandpa, northern Wisconsin boy in Phillips, Wisconsin, was on the Conservation Corps camps. And here's where we kept our folks out of harm's way, but also work on infrastructure that we still see today, that we need today. And you see it in our park and recs, and you see it on our highway and our infrastructure. And that's where I feel like we need to get back to the basics, and it starts at a local level. I agree to follow on with St. Paul and Minneapolis and tell our representation in the state and the federal government that we're suffering here at a local level, and it starts with this federal funding. So I'm in support of this.
Thank you, Councillor Boyle, and not to put words in everyone else's mouth, I just want to make sure this is publicly stated that I think this council does not only just support the 148th, but also our local Army National Guard, our Army Reserve units, but also our Coast Guard as well. So I want that to be stated publicly that we're not, you know, just selecting one of them that we support. We select all of them. So with that, go to Councillor Gardner. No, excuse me, Councillor Stauber. Sorry.
President Hartman, thank you. I do have a few things I'd like to discuss, and some of it I'm sure most of you already know, but I think it's worth mentioning that the United States is a little bit different than other countries, that our military is led by civilians, and they are the civilians that we elect. The Commander-in-Chief is the President of the United States, and he appoints the Secretary of Defense. Leon Panetta is our Secretary of Defense, and the President also selects civilian leadership for each of our departments, our Department of the Air Force, Department of Army, and Department of Navy, and so we are under civilian leadership, and this is a little different than I think the attitude was back in the 60s and early 70s with the Vietnam War, which I want to allude to briefly, because I think the public, I know the public blamed the military for what was going on in Vietnam, and there were a lot of riots. I remember the first month I put on my Air Force uniform back in 1971, I was called a baby killer, and while walking through the halls of UMD, they firebombed our ROTC building. The public in general blamed the military for what was going on, and they took action against the military. And when you flew civilian, you couldn't wear your military uniform because of what the public would do to you. And it was too bad because we had conscription back then. We had the selective service, the draft, and only men were drafted, and a lot of my friends, being of that era, were drafted, and unfortunately some never came back from Vietnam. And the public continued to blame the military for what was going on. So I guess what I'm hearing tonight is more, you know, let's let our civilian leadership know that change has to occur. I do want to talk about that Vietnam War briefly, that President Johnson, LBJ, back in 1965, really escalated that war tremendously. And he had this vision of a great society, of paying for all the issues we heard tonight about caring for the poor and education and things like that, and our seniors. But he also had to pay for this war. And we aren't that rich. We are a rich nation, but we aren't that rich to be able to afford a war in Vietnam and his great society. So he borrowed the money. He borrowed it from Social Security, as most of us know. And that's why we're in the situation we are today, because we've always been playing catch-up now with Social Security to pay for that war. That war was costing the United States $2 billion a month, which in today's terms doesn't seem like quite so much, but this back in the early 60s, mid-60s. It was incredibly expensive. I want to talk about the Secretary of Defense back then. It was Robert McNamara, and I had great admiration for SecDef of Robert McNamara back then. He seemed to know what he was doing, and LBJ seemed to know what he was doing. He was a popular president back then as well, but he was a hawk, which is unusual for a Democrat to be a hawk, and he was. He was into this war completely, at least in the beginning. Well, in the United States, we rapidly recognized that we were being inflated out of our homes. We couldn't afford things. Inflation was running not the current 2 to 3%, but we're looking at double-digit inflation year after year, and that's a different way of taxing the people. Social Security was being drawn down, but worse yet, the most important resource we lost during that Vietnam War was 58,000 lives, 58,000 Americans. So Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who often defended everything that he did back then, years later wrote this, and I'm only going to read you a little bit part of it here. From Secretary of Defense McNamara, who was both under the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration, he's asked, but why now? Why after all these years of silence am I convinced I should speak? There are many reasons. The main one is that I've grown sick at heart witnessing the cynicism and even contempt with which so many people view our political institutions and leaders. But I also know that the war caused terrible damage to America. I want to look at Vietnam in hindsight, not in any way to obscure my own and others' errors of judgment and their egregious costs, but to show the full range of pressures and the lack of knowledge that existed at the time. I want to put Vietnam in context. We of the Kennedy and Johnson administration who participated in the decisions on Vietnam acted according to what we thought were the principles and traditions of America. We made our decisions in light of those values. Yet we were wrong, terribly wrong. We owe it to future generations to explain why. It cost America an incredible amount of money. Fast forward to 2012, where we are today. We're in Afghanistan, and we're expanding into Pakistan. And on the 23rd of September of this year's NBC report, a classified assessment of war in Afghanistan by General McChrystal included his conclusion that a successful counterinsurgency strategy would require 500,000 troops and 5 years of fighting. President Barack Obama has continued to increase troop levels there. We're getting in deeper. And you got to think about this, that the Soviets, and they were the Soviets before they were the Russians, and they were the Russians before the Soviets, but the Soviets, for 9 years, fought in Afghanistan. In fact, that conflict in Afghanistan from the Soviet Union standpoint was the Soviet Union's Vietnam War. That's how it was referred to, or the bear trap, because the Soviets were considered the bear. Very expensive to go to Iraq, very expensive to go to Afghanistan, very expensive to go to Vietnam. However, I believe a strong military willing to protect America is the most crucial service our government can provide to its citizens. Sending them to war in Vietnam or Afghanistan, though, is truly questionable. I won't be supporting this resolution, but I certainly understand.
Thank you, Councilor Stauber. Go ahead, Councilor Gardner.
Thank you. Thank you, President Hartman, and thank you, Councilor Stauber. Your remarks moved me greatly, as did many of you tonight. Fletcher, others who spoke from your hearts.